The courier's feet had not touched dry ground in 7 days. Beneath the cracked soles of his boots, the black soil of the Serpent Court territory squelched with each step, releasing pockets of methane that hissed like whispered blasphemies. His name had been carved from his throat 3 winters past, when the silent brothers of New Antioch had sewn his lips with sanctified wire, leaving only a thin gap for breathing and the consumption of blessed wafers. Brother Marcus carried messages between the forward positions, his muted tongue unable to betray secrets even under the most elaborate tortures the heretic legions could devise. The parchment scroll tucked beneath his ribs bore orders written in the blood of martyrs, directing the 3rd Penitent Company to advance upon the ruins of what had once been the Cathedral of Sorrowful Contemplation. The morning mist clung to the crater walls like funeral shrouds, and through its gray embrace, Marcus glimpsed the skeletal remains of siege engines that had been abandoned when their crews had simply vanished. Not killed, not captured, vanished, leaving behind only their clothes arranged in perfect ritual circles around cold braziers still smoldering with incense that smelled of copper and myrrh. As he descended into the valley, the courier noticed how the very air seemed to thicken, pressing against his chest with the weight of unspoken confessions. The mud beneath his feet had begun to show patterns, spirals that seemed to writhe when glimpsed from the corner of his eye. Each step forward required more effort, as though the earth itself sought to claim him for some ancient hunger. The first body appeared half buried in the slick black earth, its face turned skyward in an expression of rapture so profound that Marcus found himself unable to look away. The corpse wore the remnants of Serpent Court regalia, brass scales that had turned green with verdigris, but its mouth hung open in a perfect circle, as though it had died in the middle of speaking a word too sacred or too terrible for mortal lips. Marcus pressed forward, his breath forming small clouds that seemed to linger longer than natural law should allow. The silence here was not the absence of sound, but something far more oppressive, a presence that absorbed every noise and transmuted it into something else entirely. His footsteps no longer echoed but whispered back at him in languages he did not recognize. The stone amphitheater revealed itself gradually, emerging from the mist, like a fever dream given architectural form. Ancient blocks of marble, each the size of a coffin, had been arranged in descending circles around a central depression. The stones themselves wept a clear fluid that left crystalline trails down their surfaces, and where these tears touched the earth, small flowers bloomed in impossible colors that hurt to perceive directly. At the center of this stone bowl, chained to a pillar of black obsidian, hung a figure that defied immediate comprehension. The oracle's body had been human once, perhaps a century ago when the Serpent Court had first discovered the creature in the ruins beneath Damascus. Now it possessed 7 distinct throats, each emerging from different points along what had once been a neck. The throats swayed independently, serpentine and hypnotic, each crowned with lips that moved in constant soundless recitation. Marcus approached with the careful steps of a man walking across thin ice over bottomless water. The parchment beneath his ribs suddenly felt heavier, as though the blood ink had begun to coagulate into something denser than mere writing. Around the oracle's pillar, arranged in perfect, geometric precision, lay the desiccated remains of Serpent Court supplicants, their faces locked in expressions of terminal enlightenment. The first throat turned toward him, its lips parting to reveal teeth like pearl needles. When it spoke, the words bypassed his ears entirely and carved themselves directly into his consciousness. The Third Penitent Company advances at dawn on the feast day of Saint Agatha the Punctured. They will discover the hidden passage beneath the altar where 17 martyrs were interred facing east. Captain Thorne carries doubt in his left pocket along with his father's rosary. Marcus stumbled backward, his hand instinctively moving to the scroll. The oracle had spoken of events that would not unfold for 3 days, describing movements that existed only in the sealed orders he carried. A second throat began to speak, its voice layered with harmonics that made his bones ache. Brother Marcus of the Silent Tongue brings word of the northern approach. His faith burns cold since the fever dreams began in the monastery at Carcassonne. He counts his sins on beads made from children's teeth. The courier's hand flew to his concealed prayer chain, where indeed hung beads carved from infant molars, a penance prescribed by Father Morden for the sin of pride. No living soul knew of this burden, save his confessor and God himself. Yet the oracle spoke of it as casually as commenting upon the weather. A third throat joined the chorus, its words weaving through the others like smoke through incense. New Antioch sends hunters in the dark hours when the moon wears a crown of blood. They seek to steal away the voice that speaks tomorrow's sorrow. Captain Anders leads, bearing the scar where his wife's wedding ring was cut from his flesh. Marcus felt his world tilt on its axis. The orders beneath his ribs had made no mention of a capture mission, yet the oracle spoke of it with the certainty of historical fact. He turned to flee but found his feet rooted to the weeping stones. The remaining 4 throats began their recitation, creating a symphony of prophecy that wrapped around his mind like chains. The sins of the faithful outweigh their devotions by 7 pounds and 4 ounces. Lieutenant Graves carries poison in a tooth hollowed by guilt. Sergeant Matthias hears his dead daughter singing in the wind. Private Kane has counted to 1,000 in preparation for his own death. Each revelation struck Marcus like a physical blow. These were secrets that existed only in the confessional booths of New Antioch, whispered to priests who had sworn blood oaths of silence. Yet the oracle recited them as though reading from a ledger of souls. The 5th throat continued without pause. Brother Marcus returns to New Antioch, bearing witness to the 7-tongued prophet. His report reaches Captain Anders as the cathedral bells toll vespers. The mission is approved before the ink dries on the page. The courier found himself running then, his feet finally free from whatever force had held them. Behind him, the remaining throats began to speak in unison, their words following him like hunting hounds through the mist. The hunters become the hunted, the captured becomes the captor. 7 sins for 7 souls, and the altar waits with infinite patience. Marcus did not stop running until he reached the forward positions of the Third Penitent Company, where Captain Thorne waited with his father's rosary clutched in his left hand and doubt written across his weathered features. The parchment beneath the courier's ribs felt like lead as he delivered his orders, knowing with terrible certainty that every word had already been spoken by lips that tasted of prophecy and damnation. The captain read the blood ink orders by the light of a corpse candle, and Marcus watched as recognition flickered across his face. Whatever doubts Thorne carried, they ran deeper than mere military concerns. When he looked up from the parchment, his eyes held the hollow weight of a man who had seen his own grave. "Tell command we advance as ordered," Thorne said, his voice cracking like old leather. "And Brother Marcus, pray for us. Pray for all of us." But Marcus could not pray. The oracle's words had lodged in his throat like broken glass, and every attempt at supplication emerged as the beginning of prophecies he had no wish to speak. As night fell over the Serpent Court territories, he found himself counting backward from 1,000, though he could not remember starting. Captain Anders received the mission briefing as Vesper's bells echoed across New Antioch's marble halls. The documents had arrived precisely as the Oracle had foretold, delivered by a courier whose eyes held secrets too terrible for confession. Anders traced the scar on his ring finger, remembering the day he had cut away his wedding band with a rusty knife, choosing duty over love in a moment of weakness that had defined the rest of his existence. The 7-man commando team assembled in the chapel of St. Erasmus the Flayed, where stained glass windows depicted the martyr's torments in excruciating detail. Each colored pane had been crafted from the tears of the faithful, crystallized through alchemical processes that bound human sorrow into something stronger than mere silicate. The light that filtered through cast rainbow shadows that seemed to writhe with their own malevolent life. Lieutenant Graves adjusted the hollow tooth that contained his final solution, a mercury compound blessed by the Pope's personal alchemist. The weight of it against his tongue served as a constant reminder of his contingency plans. Better to die poisoned than captured. Better to embrace the darkness on his own terms than at the enemy's pleasure. Sergeant Matthias knelt before the altar, his lips moving in silent conversation with voices only he could hear. His daughter Elena had been dead for 3 years, claimed by the plague that had swept through the civilian quarters like divine judgment. Yet she visited him still, her voice carried on wind that smelled of grave flowers and childhood innocence. Tonight her song seemed more urgent, more desperate, as though she sensed the approaching danger. Private Kane had reached 873 in his countdown, the numbers falling from his lips like drops of blood from a fresh wound. He had begun counting after the vision came to him in dreams, showing him his own death in perfect clarity, a bullet to the chest, fired by friendly hands in the confusion of battle. The numbers served as a bulwark against fate, each digit a prayer for postponement. The remaining 3 soldiers prepared in their own ways. Private Durant sharpened his blessed bayonet on a whetstone soaked in holy water, each stroke creating sparks that fell like dying stars. Corporal Valencia tested the action of his rifle, the bolt sliding home with the finality of a coffin lid. Private Somerset arranged his ammunition with obsessive precision, each bullet blessed by a different saint and engraved with microscopic prayers. Captain Anders addressed his team from the pulpit, his words echoing off walls lined with the preserved remains of martyrs. Their mummified faces gazed down with expressions of ecstatic agony, lips parted as though sharing secrets with the darkness. Brothers, we march into the heart of enemy territory to capture a prize beyond measure. The Oracle speaks truths that could turn the tide of this eternal war. We will extract the target and return to friendly lines before the enemy realizes their profit has been taken. But even as he spoke, Anders felt the weight of predestination pressing down upon him. The mission parameters had been clear, yet something in the courier's eyes suggested knowledge of outcomes not yet written. The captain touched his scarred finger again, wondering if his sacrifice had been worth the pain. The team departed New Antioch under cover of darkness, moving through trenches that had been carved into the earth by 8 centuries of constant warfare. The walls wept with moisture that might have been groundwater or might have been something far more ominous. Rats scurried between their feet, grown fat on the flesh of the fallen, their eyes reflecting the guttering flames of the eternal braziers. As they crossed into no man's land, The landscape began to change in subtle ways that set teeth on edge and made skin crawl. The mud grew blacker, more viscous, clinging to their boots with hungry tenacity. Strange flowers bloomed in shell craters, their petals the color of fresh bruises, releasing pollen that made men dream of sins they had not yet committed. Private Kane reached 912 as they approached the first checkpoint. His whispered counting had become a mantra, a desperate attempt to impose order on a world that seemed determined to dissolve into chaos. The numbers felt different now, heavier somehow, as though each digit carried its own weight of destiny. The Serpent Court outposts appeared abandoned, their brass scales tarnished black by exposure to unholy vapors. Bodies lay scattered in ritual positions, their faces turned toward a heaven that seemed farther away with each passing hour. The team moved through the positions like ghosts, leaving no trace of their passage save footprints in mud that seemed to heal itself behind them. Lieutenant Graves tasted mercury on his tongue, the hollow tooth leaking its contents in microscopic doses. The poison would take hours to build to lethal concentration, but already he could feel its cold embrace seeping through his system. Death by degrees, measured in heartbeats and diminishing hope. Sergeant Matthias heard Elena's voice growing stronger as they approached the amphitheater. She sang lullabies he had taught her as a child, melodies that now seemed to carry warnings embedded in their innocent verses. The dead child spoke of 7 mouths and 7 sins, of prophecies that devoured those who heard them like acid-consuming flesh. The stone amphitheater materialized from the mist exactly as Brother Marcus had described, its weeping marble blocks arranged in perfect circles around the central depression. The oracle hung from its obsidian pillar like a grotesque chandelier, 7 throats swaying in harmony with rhythms too complex for mortal comprehension. Captain Anders raised his hand, signaling the team to halt. The target was exactly where intelligence had indicated, yet something felt wrong. The positioning was too perfect, too convenient, as though they were actors stepping onto a stage where their roles had already been written. The first throat turned toward them before they had taken another step, its lips parting to reveal teeth like ivory thorns. 7 hunters approached the speaking stone. They carry chains forged from melted wedding rings and bullets, blessed by 7 different saints. Captain Anders leads with doubt in his heart and poison in his soul. The words struck the team like physical blows, each revelation more impossible than the last. The oracle spoke of details that existed only in their most private moments, secrets locked away in the confessional chambers of their minds. The second throat joined the recitation, its voice harmonizing with the first in ways that made reality seem to bend. Lieutenant Graves carries death in a hollow tooth, mercury blessed by the Pope's own hand. The poison spreads even now, measuring his remaining hours in diminishing heartbeats. He will die as he lived, choosing his own damnation. Graves stumbled, his hand flying to his jaw. The hollow tooth suddenly felt enormous, a foreign presence that filled his mouth with the taste of endings. No living soul knew of his contingency plan, yet the oracle spoke of it as casually as discussing the weather. The third throat continued without pause. Sergeant Matthias hears his daughter singing in the spaces between seconds. Elena died of plague but lives on in the wind that carries her father's guilt. She warns him now of the approaching betrayal, but he has forgotten how to listen to the living. Matthias fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face as Elena's voice suddenly became clear. She was screaming warnings, her childish treble cutting through the oracle's symphony like broken glass. The dead girl spoke of traps within traps, of prophecies that fulfilled themselves through the very act of being spoken. The fourth throat picked up the thread, weaving new horrors into the tapestry of revelation. Private Cain counts toward his own death, each number a step closer to friendly fire in the confusion of retreat. 917, 918, 919. The bullet waits in Corporal Valencia's rifle, blessed by Saint Sebastian the Perforated. Cain's counting faltered, the numbers tumbling from his lips in broken fragments. 920 became 940, became 812 as time seemed to fold in on itself. Valencia looked at his rifle with dawning horror, seeing it now as an instrument of fratricide rather than defense. The fifth throat spoke of Private Durant's bayonet, how it would taste the blood of allies before enemies. The sixth revealed Corporal Valencia's hidden apostasy, his secret prayers to gods whose names had been forbidden since the opening of Hell Gate Jerusalem. The seventh throat saved its revelation for Captain Anders himself. The captain's wife lives still in the convent of St. Agnes the Blind, having taken vows to forget the husband who chose war over love. She prays for his death each morning at lauds, her tears falling like rain on stones that remember everything. Anders felt something break inside his chest, a structure that had supported his entire sense of purpose crumbling into dust. Maria alive, Maria taking vows, Maria praying for his death with the same devotion she had once reserved for their marriage. The scar on his finger began to burn as though the ring were being cut away all over again. The oracle's seven throats began to speak in unison then, their voices creating harmonics that made the air itself vibrate with malevolent purpose. The hunters have become the hunted. The mission continues as written, but the script was penned in hell. 7 sins for 7 souls, and the altar waits with infinite patience. Captain Anders drew his sidearm, aiming it at the chained figure with hands that shook like autumn leaves. But the oracle only smiled with all 7 mouths, revealing rows of teeth that seemed to extend forever into the darkness of its collective throat. You cannot kill a voice, Captain. You can only silence the speaker, and silence is just another form of sound. Take the oracle to New Antioch. Complete the mission as it was always meant to be completed. Every step is a choice that was made before you were born. The team surrounded the pillar, their movements mechanical now, driven by a compulsion that felt like destiny crystallized into physical law. They cut the chains with bolt cutters that screamed as they bit through metal that had been forged in fires fueled by human suffering. The oracle's weight settled onto a stretcher that had been blessed by 7 different priests, each blessing now revealed as a curse in disguise. As they began their retreat through no man's land, the oracle's 7 throats continued their endless recitation. Each mouth spoke to a different member of the team, whispering personalized prophecies that burrowed into their minds like parasites, seeking warm places to lay eggs. To Captain Anders, the first throat spoke of his wife's nightly prayers, how she begged God to grant her husband the peace that only death could provide. Each word was a knife twisted in the wound of his abandoned marriage, revealing the depth of love, corrupted into something that resembled hatred, but cut far deeper. To Lieutenant Graves, the second throat detailed the progression of mercury poisoning through his system, describing the symptoms with clinical precision. First the tremors, then the hallucinations, finally the merciful release as his nervous system collapsed under the weight of metallic contamination. The poison had been his choice, but the oracle made it feel like destiny. To Sergeant Matthias, the third throat carried Elena's voice, but not as he remembered it. The dead child spoke now with the wisdom of the grave, revealing the true nature of guilt and how it feeds on the souls of the living, like cancer feeds on healthy flesh. She warned him that love could become a chain binding him to torments beyond mortal comprehension. To Private Kane, the fourth throat counted backward from 1,000, each number falling like a hammer blow against the anvil of fate. 915, 914, 913. The countdown had become external now, no longer contained within his own mind but echoing through the landscape like the tolling of funeral bells. To Private Durant, the fifth throat spoke of blood, specifically the taste and texture of friendly blood spilled by blessed steel. The bayonet at his side grew heavier with each step, its sanctified metal humming with anticipation of violence that would damn him beyond any possibility of redemption. To Corporal Valencia, the sixth throat whispered prayers in languages that predated Christianity. Older gods whose names had been scratched from history but whose power remained potent in the spaces between faith and despair. His rifle felt alien in his hands now, a thing of blasphemous purpose rather than righteous protection. To Private Somerset, the seventh throat revealed the true blessing carried by his carefully arranged ammunition. Each bullet had been prayed over not by saints but by the damned, their benedictions twisted into maledictions that would ensure every shot found its mark in the flesh of the faithful. The retreat became a procession of the damned, 7 men carrying their captured prophet through a landscape that seemed to reshape itself around their passage. The mud grew deeper, more viscous, clutching at their feet with the desperate hunger of the earth for fresh corpses. Strange lights flickered in the distance, corpse, candles, marking graves that had not yet been dug. Private Kane reached 900 as they crossed the first checkpoint, his mechanical counting now synchronized with the oracle's own recitation. The numbers felt heavy on his tongue, each digit carrying the weight of approaching doom. He could see his own death now, playing out in his peripheral vision like a reflection in water that showed tomorrow instead of today. Lieutenant Graves felt the mercury spreading through his bloodstream, each heartbeat carrying poison to new territories of his body. The hollow tooth had begun to crack under the pressure of constant grinding, releasing its contents in measured doses that calculated his remaining time with chemical precision. Death, by degrees, approaching like sunrise over a battlefield. Sergeant Matthias walked in conversation with his dead daughter, her voice now audible to his conscious mind rather than existing only in the spaces between thoughts. Helena spoke of the trap they were walking into, how the oracle's capture was not a victory, but the first movement in a symphony of damnation that would play until the last trumpet sounded. The landscape around them began to change as they approached friendly lines, but the changes felt wrong, as though they were walking backward through time into a past that had been retroactively corrupted. Trees grew in reverse, their branches reaching down into the earth while roots clawed at the sky. Streams flowed uphill, carrying water that reflected faces of the yet-to-die. Captain Anders found himself thinking of Maria with every step, her face superimposed over the muddy terrain like a double exposure on photographic film. The oracle's first throat had revealed truths that cut deeper than any enemy blade, wounds that would never heal because they were carved from the substance of love itself, transformed into regret. The team's formation began to loosen as they progressed, each man drawn into private contemplation of the prophecies that had been whispered into their ears. The oracle's weight on the stretcher seemed to fluctuate wildly, sometimes light as air, sometimes heavy as lead, as though its mass were determined by the collective guilt of its carriers rather than any physical law. Private Durant felt his bayonet growing warm against his leg, the blessed steel reacting to something in the air around them. The weapon had tasted blood in a dozen battles, but now it seemed a hunger for a different kind of violence, something more intimate and therefore more damning. His grip on the rifle tightened unconsciously, knuckles white with tension that had nothing to do with fear of the enemy. Corporal Valencia began to mutter prayers in the old tongue, words that had been forbidden since the Council of Trent, but which felt more honest than any sanctioned benediction. The rifle slung across his back grew heavier with each syllable, its weight increasing in proportion to his growing apostasy. He could feel his faith cracking like ice over deep water, the sound of its breaking echoing inside his skull. Private Somerset arranged and rearranged his ammunition compulsively, each bullet finding its way into new configurations that formed patterns he did not consciously recognize. The blessed lead seemed to whisper when the pieces touched, sharing secrets in a language of metallurgy and malice. His fingers moved without conscious direction, guided by impulses that originated somewhere outside his own will. The oracle's 7 throats continued their recitation throughout the retreat, their voices weaving together into a tapestry of prophecy that covered every possible future with threads of inevitability. Each prediction was a trap disguised as information, every revelation a chain that bound its hearer more tightly to a fate they had thought to avoid. As they approached the outer perimeter of New Antioch, the first throats spoke of the reception waiting for them, how Commander Blackwood would greet their success with celebration that would turn to horror within the hour. The captured oracle would be installed in the deepest vaults beneath the cathedral, where its prophecies would guide military strategy until strategy became indistinguishable from suicide. The second throat detailed the spread of knowledge through the command structure, how each officer who consulted the oracle would become infected with the certainty of predetermined doom. Free will would evaporate like morning dew under the sun of absolute prophecy, leaving only the illusion of choice in a world where every decision had already been made. The third throat spoke of the theological implications, how the Church would struggle to reconcile the oracle's existence with doctrines of divine providence and human agency. Scholars would debate whether prophecy created fate or merely revealed it, never realizing that the question itself was a trap designed to consume centuries of faithful inquiry. The fourth throat revealed the military consequences, how commanders armed with perfect knowledge of the future would find themselves paralyzed by the weight of inevitability. Battles would be won before they were fought, but victory would taste like ashes in the mouths of those who achieved it through predestination rather than valor. The fifth throat whispered of the personal costs, how each member of the extraction team would find their lives unraveling in accordance with the prophecies they had heard. Free will was an illusion, but it was an illusion that made life bearable. Without it, existence became merely the mechanical playing out of scripts written by others. The sixth throat spoke of the oracle itself, how it had once been human before the Serpent Court's experiments had transformed it into something that existed simultaneously in all possible futures. The seven throats were not additions but revelations, manifestations of the multiplicities contained within every human soul. To see the oracle was to see humanity's potential for transcendence and damnation displayed in perfect symmetry. The seventh throat saved its final revelation for the moment they crossed into friendly territory, where sentries greeted them with relief that would soon transform into something approaching terror. The mission is complete, but completion is only the beginning. 7 sins for 7 souls, and the altar waits with infinite patience. The hunters have delivered themselves to their own sacrifice, wrapped in the chains of their own choices. The gates of New Antioch opened before them like jaws closing on prey, and Captain Anders felt the weight of inevitability settling on his shoulders like a funeral shroud. Behind them, the oracle's laughter echoed across no man's land, 7 voices singing in harmony about tomorrows that had already been written in blood and sealed with suffering. The extraction was complete, but completion felt less like victory than capitulation to forces that had manipulated them from the moment they first heard the oracle's name. They carried their prize through streets lined with faithful, who would soon learn that faith itself could become a prison when prophecy replaced prayer, certainty supplanted hope, and the future devoured the present with the hunger of something that had waited 8 centuries to feed. Private Kane's count reached 950 as they approached the cathedral, each number now falling from his lips like drops of blood from a mortal wound. The oracle's 4th throat had synchronized with his countdown, creating a duet of predestination that made every step forward feel like a march toward execution. His rifle felt foreign in his hands, its familiar weight transformed into something that promised betrayal rather than protection. Lieutenant Graves tasted metal flooding his mouth as the mercury reached critical concentration in his bloodstream. The hollow tooth had finally cracked completely, releasing its entire payload in a rush that made his vision blur and his hands shake uncontrollably. The oracle's 2nd throat had spoken true. He would die as he had lived, by his own choice. But choice itself now felt like an elaborate deception designed to make him complicit in his own destruction. Sergeant Matthias walked in constant conversation with Elena now, her ghostly voice audible above the cathedral bells that tolled vespers across New Antioch. The dead child spoke of the trap they were delivering themselves into, how the oracle's presence would corrupt everything it touched like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of damnation spreading outward until they encompassed all of creation. The cathedral doors opened before them, revealing an interior that had been prepared for their arrival with disturbing precision. Candles burned in arrangements that matched the oracle's prophecies exactly, their flames casting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The altar had been cleared of its usual appointments and fitted with chains that looked identical to those they had cut from the obsidian pillar. Commander Blackwood waited in the transept, his face bearing an expression of satisfaction that would have been appropriate for a hunter displaying his prize. But as his eyes fell upon the oracle, stretching out on its litter like a grotesque parody of Christ's descent from the cross, satisfaction began to curdle into something approaching recognition of his own error. "Outstanding work, Captain," Blackwood said, his voice echoing off walls lined with the preserved remains of saints whose empty eye sockets seemed to track the oracle's movement. "The strategic advantages this creature will provide are beyond calculation. With perfect knowledge of enemy movements, we can end this war within a year." But, even as he spoke, The commander's voice carried undertones of doubt, as though some part of him understood that wars fueled by prophecy rather than courage were victories that devoured the victors. The oracle's 7 throats had remained silent during the transition, but their lips moved in constant, soundless recitation that made the air itself feel heavy with unspoken words. Captain Anders saluted mechanically, his hand moving through the familiar gesture, while his mind remained focused on the oracle's first throat and its revelation about Maria. His wife's prayers for his death now seemed less like cruelty than mercy, a kind of love too profound for his limited understanding. The scar on his ring finger burned like a brand, marking him as one who had chosen duty over devotion, and found both to be hollow when examined closely. The oracle was transferred to the deepest vaults beneath the cathedral, where stone cells had housed dangerous relics since the days when New Antioch was merely Antioch and hell had not yet opened its gates in Jerusalem. The 7 throats were chained separately, each mouth secured with bonds that had been blessed by different saints, as though the church hoped to contain the creature's power through theological compartmentalization. But, even chained and separated, the oracle's voices carried through the stone walls with supernatural clarity. Each throat spoke to different members of the command staff, sharing prophecies tailored to their specific sins and sorrows. Within hours, the entire military hierarchy of New Antioch was infected with the certainty of predetermined doom, their free will evaporating like water poured on hot stone. Private Durant found himself standing guard duty outside the oracle's cell, his bayonet fixed and ready despite the absurdity of threatening a chained prisoner with pointed steel. The blessed blade hummed against his rifle barrel, vibrating in harmony with sounds too low for human ears to detect. The oracle's 5th throat had spoken true. The weapon thirsted for friendly blood, and the taste would damn him beyond any possibility of redemption. Corporal Valencia took up position at the opposite end of the corridor, his rifle loaded with bullets that Private Somerset had arranged in patterns that now revealed themselves as sigils of binding and release. The ammunition whispered constantly now, sharing secrets in the language of lead and powder, teaching him prayers that predated Christianity and would outlast it when the world finally burned itself clean. Private Somerset himself sat in the antechamber, cleaning weapons with obsessive precision while counting bullets like rosary beads. Each piece of ammunition told its own story of the death it was destined to deal, revealing targets and trajectories with prophetic accuracy. His hands moved without conscious direction, guided by knowledge that originated in the oracle's 7th throat and had taken root in the fertile soil of his despair. The first night passed without incident, but incident was a concept that had become meaningless in a world where every outcome was predetermined. The oracle's prophecies spread through the garrison like plague, infecting every conversation with the weight of inevitability. Soldiers who had faced death with courage for decades now found themselves paralyzed by the certainty of specific dooms awaiting them at specific times in specific places. Lieutenant Graves collapsed during the 2nd watch, mercury poisoning finally overwhelming his system in exactly the manner the oracle had predicted. He died with the hollow tooth clenched between his jaws, his final breath carrying the taste of metals that had been blessed by papal hands and cursed by prophetic tongues. His body was found in a position that matched descriptions given by the oracle's 2nd throat to the minute detail, down to the angle of his fingers and the expression of relief frozen on his face. Sergeant Matthias lasted until dawn, when Elena's voice finally convinced him to open his wrists with a blessed razor rather than endure the slow dissolution of sanity that awaited him. The dead child had spoken of madness spreading like infection through minds that tried to contain prophetic knowledge meant for divine consciousness alone. His blood pooled in patterns that matched the oracle's third prophecy exactly, forming symbols that hurt to look at directly but conveyed meaning that bypassed rational thought entirely. Private Kane reached 999 just as Corporal Valencia's rifle discharged, the bullet finding its mark in his chest with supernatural accuracy. The blessed lead tore through flesh and bone that had been consecrated to service, but service to what remained unclear as his life drained away in measured heartbeats. His final count never reached 1,000. The oracle's fourth throat had lied about that detail, or perhaps truth itself was more flexible than mortals understood. Private Durant's bayonet found its mark in Captain Anders' back as the sun rose over New Antioch, the blessed steel sliding between ribs with the ease of hot knife through butter. The wound was precise, calculated to cause maximum suffering while ensuring eventual death. Punishment for the sin of choosing duty over love carried out by hands that had been guided by prophetic compulsion rather than conscious malice. Corporal Valencia turned his rifle on Private Somerset before either man realized what was happening. Muscle memory and prophetic predestination combining to create movements that felt like choice but were merely the playing out of scripts written before their births. The bullet found its mark with perfect accuracy, sending blessed lead through a heart that had been measured and found wanting by scales that weighed souls rather than flesh. Private Somerset's finger tightened on his own trigger as he fell, sending his final bullet through Valencia's skull in a moment of synchronicity that would have been beautiful if it had not been so absolutely damned. The two soldiers died within seconds of each other, their blood mingling on stones that had witnessed 8 centuries of similar sacrifices. By morning, the entire extraction team was dead, their bodies arranged in positions that matched the oracle's prophecies with disturbing precision. Commander Blackwood found them at dawn, his face pale with the recognition that perfect knowledge was indistinguishable from perfect damnation. The oracle had been captured, but the capture had been a trap disguised as victory, bait offered to hunters who had become prey through the very act of hunting. The oracle's 7 throats continued their endless recitation from the depths of the cathedral vaults, but now they spoke only to each other, creating harmonies of prophecy that reached into every corner of New Antioch, like fingers of corrupted light. The faithful who heard these voices found their prayers changing without conscious intention, supplications transforming into invocations of powers that had been old when the world was young. Father Mordaunt arrived from Carcassonne 3 days later, summoned by reports that made no sense when read separately, but revealed a terrible pattern when considered together. The old priest found the cathedral in chaos, its clergy unable to perform even basic rituals without their words becoming prophecies that fulfilled themselves in increasingly grotesque ways. Mass had been suspended after Father Clement's blessing of the communion wine had turned it to actual blood, not through transubstantiation but through some more literal and horrifying transformation. The oracle's influence had spread beyond the vaults like spores from diseased fruit, carried on every breath, embedded in every whispered prayer. Mordaunt descended into the depths with holy water that steamed when it touched the air, and a crucifix that had begun to weep actual tears of silver. The stone steps grew slick with moisture that might have been condensation, or might have been something far more organic, each level deeper revealing new manifestations of spiritual decay. The 7 throats hung in their separate cells, each mouth continuing its endless recitation despite the blessed chains that bound them. But the chains themselves had begun to change, their sanctified metal taking on organic properties that pulsed with rhythms too complex for mortal hearts to follow. The oracle's flesh had started to merge with its bonds, or perhaps the bonds were merging with the oracle, creating a hybrid entity that existed in the space between captivity and freedom. Mordant approached the first throat, its lips moving in constant prayer to gods whose names had been forgotten before Rome was built. The words bypassed his ears entirely, carving themselves directly into his consciousness with the precision of surgical instruments. He learned things he had no wish to know, prophecies concerning his own order, the monastery at Carcassonne, the children's teeth that formed prayer beads in the pockets of the faithful. "Father," the throat whispered, its voice carrying harmonics that made the stone walls weep, "you have come to perform the last rites for a war that ended before it began. 800 years of conflict, and every battle was fought in service to this moment. Every death, a sacrament, every victory, a step closer to this altar." The old priest raised his crucifix, but the silver tears had begun to pool at his feet, forming patterns that hurt to perceive directly. The sacred symbol felt heavier in his hands, as though it were absorbing the weight of every sin ever confessed in the cathedral above. His own sins seemed insignificant compared to the collective guilt that pressed down upon him like the atmosphere of a dying world. The second throat spoke of time itself, how it moved in spirals rather than lines, each revolution bringing humanity closer to revelations that would make the opening of Hellgate Jerusalem seem like a minor theological disagreement. The extraction team had not captured the oracle, but had delivered themselves to it, their deaths serving as keys to locks that had been waiting 8 centuries to open. "The war never ends, Father, because ending is just another form of beginning. New Antioch falls, but it has already fallen. The serpent court rises, but it has already risen. You have come to witness the conclusion of something that was concluded before you drew your first breath." Mordant felt his faith beginning to crack like ice over deep water, the sound of its breaking echoing through chambers carved from living rock. He had ministered to the dying for 40 years, offering comfort through doctrine and ritual, but now the very foundations of belief seemed as insubstantial as morning mist. The oracle spoke of cycles that encompassed eons, patterns too vast for human comprehension yet too intimate to ignore. The third throat sang lullabies and voices of the dead, melodies that carried the weight of every mother who had lost children to 8 centuries of holy war. Each note was a tear crystallized into sound, each harmony a prayer that had gone unanswered until this moment, when all prayers would be answered in ways that made unanswering seem like mercy. Commander Blackwood appeared at the foot of the stairs, his uniform stained with substances that reflected light in ways that natural materials should not. His eyes held the hollow weight of a man who had looked too deeply into futures that were simultaneously inevitable and impossible. Behind him came the surviving members of his staff, their faces bearing expressions of rapture so profound it resembled madness. "Father Mordant," Blackwood said, his voice carrying undertones that seemed to originate from multiple sources simultaneously, "you arrive precisely when the oracle foretold. Your presence completes the circle, closes the loop, finalizes the equation that has been solving itself since the first crusade set foot in the Holy Land. The fourth throat began to count, its voice synchronizing with the footsteps of soldiers who were no longer quite soldiers, their humanity having been refined into something more specific and therefore more terrible. Numbers fell like hammer blows against the anvil of reality, each digit reshaping the world in microscopic but cumulative ways. Mathematics became theology, and theology revealed itself as applied mathematics. Mordin found himself counting along, unable to stop the numbers that spilled from his lips like blood from a fresh wound. 733, 734, 735. Each number felt significant, weighted with meaning that bypassed rational understanding and lodged directly in the primitive centers of his brain where fear and worship originated from the same electrical impulses. The fifth throat spoke of weapons, specifically blessed weapons that had tasted friendly blood and found it more nourishing than enemy flesh. Every bayonet that had pierced allied hearts, every bullet that had found its mark in faithful bodies, every blade that had opened veins containing prayers instead of merely blood. The Oracle had guided each death, choreographed each betrayal, orchestrated each act of violence, until violence became indistinguishable from worship. The sixth throat revealed the true nature of the Serpent Court's experiments, how they had sought to create prophets who could speak tomorrow's truth with today's tongue. The Oracle was their greatest success, and their ultimate failure, a creature that saw all possible futures simultaneously and therefore existed in none of them completely. To consult it was to step outside the flow of time and discover that free will was a comforting lie told to keep mortals from despair. The seventh throat saved its final revelation for Father Mordaunt himself, speaking words that rewrote his understanding of everything he had believed about faith, duty, and the nature of divine purpose. The children's teeth in his prayer beads were not symbols of penance but seeds of prophecy, each molar containing the compressed essence of innocence that had been sacrificed to maintain the illusion of righteousness. Your monastery at Carcassonne was built on a foundation of infant skulls, Father. The Brothers of Silence take vows not to preserve sacred secrets, but to prevent the speaking of truths that would unmake the world. You have served faithfully, but service and faith are chains disguised as virtues. Mordaunt fell to his knees, the prayer beads spilling from his pockets, like scattered teeth from a broken jaw. Each bead hit the stone floor with a sound that echoed through chambers that extended far beyond the physical boundaries of the cathedral. The Oracle's seven throats began to speak in unison then, their voices weaving together into harmonies that transformed the air itself into something too thick to breathe comfortably. The altar waits, Father. It has waited 800 years for this moment when all debts are paid and all accounts balanced. The war ends not in victory or defeat, but in understanding. The faithful and the damned are revealed to be the same entity viewed from different angles. The walls began to weep blood that pooled in patterns too complex for accidental formation. Sacred geometry rendered in substances that had once flowed through the veins of martyrs and murderers alike. Mordaunt realized that he was witnessing not the corruption of holiness but the revelation of holiness's true nature, stripped of comforting lies and revealed in all its terrible beauty. Commander Blackwood and his staff moved with mechanical precision, their actions guided by knowledge that originated in the Oracle's throats, but had taken root in soil prepared by 8 centuries of faithful service. They arranged themselves in positions that matched astronomical configurations, human bodies becoming elements in equations that calculated the precise moment when prophecy would devour reality completely. The counting reached 900. then 950, then 999. But instead of reaching 1,000, the numbers began to count backward, unwinding time itself, until past and future became indistinguishable concepts with no practical meaning. Morden felt his own history unraveling, memories dissolving like salt in water until he could no longer remember whether he had come to the cathedral to perform an exorcism or to participate in an apotheosis. The oracle's flesh continued its merger with the blessed chains, metal and meat becoming a single substance that pulsed with rhythms too complex for mortal hearts to sustain. The seven throats spoke as one now, their individual voices having resolved into a perfect harmony that contained every prayer ever offered and every curse ever spoken. The sound was simultaneously beautiful and unbearable, salvation and damnation expressed in frequencies that human ears were never meant to process. Morden understood then that he had not come to save New Antioch, but to witness its transfiguration, to observe the moment when 8 centuries of faithful service revealed their true purpose. The war had never been about reclaiming the Holy Land, but about creating conditions under which humanity could evolve beyond the limitations of free will and embrace the terrible beauty of absolute predestination. The oracle spoke its final prophecy then, words that encompassed all possible futures and revealed them to be facets of a single, inevitable outcome. Every choice that had ever been made, every prayer that had ever been offered, every sin that had ever been committed had been steps in a dance choreographed before the first human drew breath. The faithful had served faithfully, but their service had been to purposes far grander and more terrible than any doctrine had ever dared to suggest. Father Morden felt his consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of his skull, his individual identity dissolving into something larger and infinitely more connected. The children's teeth in his prayer beads began to sing in voices too pure for adult throats, harmonizing with the oracle's eternal recitation in ways that made the distinction between sacred and profane meaningless. The cathedral above began to collapse, but collapse was merely another word for transformation. Stone became flesh, flesh became light. Light became sound that carried the weight of 8 centuries of accumulated prayers. New Antioch was not being destroyed, but was being refined into its essential form, purified of everything except the raw need to serve something greater than individual comprehension. The oracle's 7 throats smiled with lips that had tasted every possible future and found them all equally necessary. The prophecies had been fulfilled not through the choices of mortals, but through the absence of choice. Through the recognition that freedom was an illusion maintained to make service bearable for minds too small to grasp their true purpose. As the stones overhead ground themselves into powder that fell like snow blessed by forces older than Christianity, Morden realized that his arrival had indeed completed the circle. But circles had no beginning and no end, only eternal revolution around centers that remained forever hidden from those who traced their circumference. The oracle spoke once more, its 7 voices now indistinguishable from the collapse above and the silence below. The altar receives what has always been offered, 7 sins for 7 souls, and the offering is complete. The war ends as it began, in service to something that was never named, because names limit, and limitation is the source of all suffering.